The saloon smelled of smoke, whiskey, and sweat. Lamps burned low, shadows clung to the walls, and every sound carried, the slap of cards, the clink of glass, the scrape of boots against rough pine floorboards. Outside, the sun had dropped behind the horizon, leaving the world washed in violet dusk. Inside, one man's world was about to collapse. Elias Turner had lost everything: land, cattle, reputation, burned away by bad choices and worse luck. His hands shook as he lifted his last cards from the table, his jaw working, lips dry. Around him, a circle of men leaned close, eager to see him fail again. They'd been watching him lose all night, like wolves circling a dying steer. And then, desperate, Elias said the words that silenced even the piano in the corner. "My daughter." The men froze. Cards hung in midair. A drunk snorted in disbelief. "I'll stake her," Elias rasped, his eyes bloodshot, face pale beneath the grime. 18. Virgin. "She'll make a fine wife to someone here. I swear it." Gasps. A curse muttered. Laughter, cruel and mean. But not from the man at the far end of the table. He sat tall, shoulders squared, hat brim shadowing his face. His shirt was dusty, sleeves rolled to thick forearms scarred by work and war. He had the look of a man who'd buried more than he'd ever spoken about. The widowed rancher, John Caldwell. Folks whispered about him, how his wife had died 2 winters back, leaving him with 3 children he barely held together. How the land had hardened him, shaped him into something unyielding. He looked up now, slow, steady. His eyes locked on Elias. Then, past him, to the girl standing by the saloon doors. She was small, wrapped in a faded shawl, hair dark and braided tight as if to hide its length. Her face was pale but proud, lips pressed together to keep from trembling. Her eyes, wide, haunted, didn't belong in a place like this. She clutched a worn satchel to her chest like a shield. John Caldwell's gaze held hers for only a heartbeat, but it was enough to make her throat close. "I'll take the hand," John said finally, voice low and even, like a hammer on a coffin lid. The card slapped. Men leaned in. Minutes later, Elias groaned, face collapsing into his hands. He had lost. And just like that, her life was no longer her own. The walk from the saloon to the rancher's wagon was a blur. The girl, her name was Clara, though nobody had spoken it tonight, moved like she was floating outside her own body. Her father didn't meet her eyes. He shoved her forward, muttering apologies she didn't believe. John Caldwell said nothing. He took her satchel, tossed it into the wagon bed, and helped her climb up. His grip was firm, calloused, but not unkind. Still, she flinched. They rode out of town in silence, only the creak of wheels and the steady clop of hooves filling the night air. The saloon's glow faded behind them until it was just another flicker swallowed by the dark. Clara kept her arms wrapped tight around herself, staring at the endless stretch of plains. Stars pricked the sky, cold and distant. Every breath felt heavy in her chest. She was 18. Still a virgin. And now bound to a man she did not know, with 3 children who, rumor said, hated the thought of another woman in their house. The silence stretched. Finally, she dared to glance at him. John Caldwell's profile was carved from shadow and moonlight. Strong jaw, lined brow, eyes narrowed against the night. He looked like stone come to life. But there was something in the set of his mouth, not cruelty, not desire, something harder. Resignation. When he finally spoke, his voice startled her. "You'll work hard on my land. I won't promise ease. My children don't take kindly to strangers. You'll earn their respect, or you won't. That's for you to prove." Clara swallowed. Her lips trembled. "And if I can't?" His jaw tightened. "Then you won't last." The ranch appeared at dawn. A lonely silhouette against the blood-red sky. Weathered fences, sagging barn, fields stretching out like scars on the land. A place beaten down but not yet broken. 3 figures stood by the porch as the wagon rolled in. 2 boys, one about 14, the other younger by a couple years, stood shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, eyes narrow. Their sister, maybe 10, clutched a rag doll and stared with open hostility. They didn't greet her. Didn't speak at all. John climbed down first, then helped Clara, though she hesitated before taking his hand. "This is Clara," he told the children, voice firm. "She'll be staying here. You'll show her respect." The older boy snorted. The younger smirked. The girl hugged her doll tighter. Clara felt their stares burn into her like brands. She wanted to shrink, to vanish. But she lifted her chin instead. If she broke now, she'd never survive this place. Her first day was a trial by fire. The kitchen smelled of ashes and failure. She burned biscuits black, spilled milk across the table, and sliced her finger trying to chop vegetables. The children laughed openly, whispering cruel jokes just loud enough for her to hear. John said nothing, only watched with that unreadable stare. He corrected her once, twice, his voice calm but sharp. He didn't scold, but neither did he shield her. By evening, Clara collapsed on the narrow bed in the small room they'd given her, once a storage space, now barely furnished with a cot and a cracked basin. She pressed her hands over her face and wept silently, choking back sobs so the children wouldn't hear. She thought of her old home. Of her mother's hands braiding her hair. Of laughter long gone. Now she had been traded away like cattle, forced into a family that didn't want her. But beneath the grief, a flicker of anger stirred. She hadn't chosen this. Yet she would not be their whipping post forever. That night, as the house slept, she lay awake. The wind howled against the shutters, coyotes yipped in the distance. Her body ached, but her mind refused to rest. Then, she heard it. A creak outside. Soft footsteps near the barn. She sat up, heart pounding. Shadows moved past the window. Not the children, they were asleep. Not John, he'd have made more noise. Someone else was out there. She crept to the window, peered through the crack. A figure hunched by the barn door, fumbling with something, metal glinting in the moonlight. Her breath caught. Before she could cry out, a hand gripped her shoulder. She spun, gasping. John stood there, silent as death. His eyes locked on hers, finger to his lips. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "And keep the children inside." He pulled his rifle from the wall and slipped out into the dark. Clara pressed her hands to her mouth, her whole body trembling. The night outside seemed alive with menace. Whoever was out there hadn't come for cattle. They had come for blood. The dawn after the intruder was uneasy. Smoke still clung faintly to the air near the barn, where John had stood for hours in the dark, rifle across his chest, eyes narrowed on the horizon. Whoever had crept onto his land had fled before dawn, leaving only the faint marks of boot heels in the dirt and the barn door latch broken. Clara had not slept. Every creak of the windmill, every howl of a coyote made her jolt upright, expecting the shadow to return. When morning finally bled through the curtains, her bones felt heavier than iron. The children, however, acted as though nothing had happened. "Pa's always scarin' folks off," the older boy muttered when Clara served a lopsided plate of eggs. "Ain't nothing new." The younger one grinned. "Maybe they came to take her. Can't say I'd blame him." Clara's hand froze over the skillet. Heat rushed to her cheeks, but she kept her back turned, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Enough," John said, his voice low and cutting. The boys fell silent, but their smirks lingered. The youngest, little Emily, just stared at Clara, her small fingers stroking the rag doll's frayed hair. The look in her eyes wasn't playful. It was suspicion, sharpened by grief too old for a child. The ranch house was quiet, too quiet. Days blurred into chores. Clara scrubbed floors until her knuckles split, hauled water from the well, tried her hand at cooking meals that the children either picked at or pushed away. Each mistake drew snickers, rolled eyes, or sighs of disappointment. The silence in the house was a weight all its own. There was no laughter, no music, no softness. Only the scrape of chairs, the slam of doors, the crackle of firewood. Even John spoke little. He left before sunrise, working the fences, herding cattle, or repairing the barn. When he returned, dust-streaked and weary, he sat at the table with his children, eating without expression. Clara hovered at the edges, unsure if she was guest, servant, or ghost. Once, she tried conversation. "Would you like more coffee, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked softly one morning. His eyes flicked to hers. "John," he said simply. Then he stood, chair scraping, and left for the day. It was something, though. A crack in the wall of silence. Nights were the worst. The prairie wind pressed against the house, whistling through cracks. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries both mournful and mocking. Clara lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts circled back to that figure at the barn, who it was, why they'd come, if they'd return. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps again, only to find the yard empty under the moonlight. One night, unable to stand the suffocating quiet, she slipped outside. The sky stretched endless, stars sharp as glass. The land smelled of sagebrush and dust, vast and merciless. She wrapped her shawl tighter and whispered to the dark, "I will not break. I will not break." The words hung in the night air, fragile but defiant. Trouble began to creep closer. It started with the cattle. 2 cows were found dead by the creek, their throats cut. John's face tightened as he examined the carcasses, his jaw working. "This ain't wolves," he muttered, half to himself. "This is a message." Next came the horses. One morning, Clara found the stable in disarray, tack slashed, oats spilled, the mare trembling with wide eyes. Whoever had done it wanted to rattle them. Whispers spread in town. Clara overheard them when she ventured in for supplies. The Caldwell ranch was cursed, enemies circling, the widow too proud to sell his land. Some said rival cattlemen were behind it. Others hinted at old grudges, debts unpaid. When she returned, the children bombarded her with questions she couldn't answer. "Did folks laugh at us?" the older boy demanded. "Are we gonna lose the ranch?" the younger one asked, his voice sharp but edged with fear. Emily just clung to Clara's skirt, silent. Clara knelt, smoothing the girl's tangled hair. "No one's taking you from your home," she whispered. "Not while I'm here." The promise shocked even her. She hadn't meant to say it, but once spoken, it felt true. Clara found herself stumbling into small victories. One morning, the biscuits rose golden instead of burning black. John ate 2 without a word, which was more praise than she expected. The children still teased, but less sharply. When the youngest boy mocked her clumsy attempt at milking, she flicked a drop of milk onto his nose. For the first time, he laughed, an honest laugh, surprised and unwilling. She began learning the rhythms of the land, the way the sky shifted before a storm, how the cattle lowed different when uneasy, how the silence deepened when danger was near. Her hands toughened, her back grew strong. And slowly, she found her voice. When the boys left their chores undone, she didn't shrink from scolding them. When Emily refused to eat, Clara coaxed her gently, telling stories of her own mother's kitchen. "Why were you even here?" the older boy snapped one evening when she reminded him to stack firewood. Clara's hand stilled. She met his glare without wavering. "Because your father thought I was worth bringing here. If you think otherwise, prove me wrong by being better than me." The boy's mouth opened, then shut. For once, he had no answer. But the shadows didn't relent. One night, a gunshot shattered the silence. Clara jolted awake, heart pounding. Boots thundered down the hall, John's voice, sharp, "Get the children. Now." Clara threw on her shawl, racing into the small room where the boys slept. She shook them awake, whispering fiercely, "Up, hurry." Emily stumbled out clutching her doll, eyes wide with terror. Another gunshot cracked outside. The boys froze, but Clara shoved them forward. "Downstairs. Go." They crowded into the parlor, Clara pushing them behind the heavy table. She snatched a lantern, its light trembling as much as her hands. John burst through the door, rifle smoking. His face was hard, jaw clenched. "Stay down," he ordered, scanning the windows. Clara's breath caught. Through the glass, faint shapes moved in the yard, shadows darting between fence posts, low voices carried by the wind. The ranch was under attack. John crouched by the window, firing once. A cry split the night. The children whimpered, clinging to Clara. She held them close, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. The fight outside grew louder, boots pounding, gunfire flashing. Smoke from the chimney carried sparks into the night, as if the house itself might ignite. Clara forced herself to stay calm. The children's terror was a weight in her arms, but she steadied her voice. "You're safe. Your father won't let them in." In truth, she wasn't sure. But she had to believe it. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence fell. John stepped back inside, chest heaving, rifle barrel hot. His eyes swept over them, Clara holding Emily, the boys pressed against her sides. "They're gone," he said, though his voice carried no relief. "But they'll be back." Clara's gaze lingered on him, on the smoke curling from his rifle, on the fear he refused to show his children. And she realized with a jolt of certainty, whatever storm was coming, she was part of it now. The barn still smelled of smoke days after the night attack. The wood was blackened in patches, the earth around it charred where torches had landed. Clara stood in the doorway, skirts brushing the ash, heart heavy as she watched John hammer new planks into place. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, every strike of the hammer echoing like a warning bell. She wanted to ask what he planned next, what enemies hunted them. But his jaw was set like stone, and she knew better than to press. Instead, she turned back to the children. They worked half-heartedly beside her, hauling buckets, scattering feed. Fear had settled in their bones, though the boys masked it with bravado and Emily with silence. That night still replayed in Clara's mind, gunshots tearing through the dark, shadows moving across the yard, the way John's rifle had cracked lightning from his hands. She had held the children close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. But something had shifted in her since then. She was no longer just the girl who had been given away. This was her fight now, too. The next test came sooner than anyone expected. It began with silence. The cattle grew restless near the southern fence, lowing uneasily. Dogs barked, hackles raised. Then the smell of smoke drifted on the wind. John cursed under his breath, grabbing his rifle. "Stay with the children," he barked at Clara. But Clara didn't stay. She grabbed a pail of water and followed, skirts catching on sagebrush as she ran toward the smoke. By the time she reached the fence line, flames were already licking the dry grass, racing toward the barn. "Back!" John roared when he saw her. "Get clear!" But Clara didn't run. She dropped to her knees, beating at the flames with her shawl, choking on smoke. Sparks stung her skin, but she kept striking until the fire sputtered. The children appeared behind her, hauling their own buckets, eyes wide with fear but hands steady. Together, they smothered the fire before it could reach the barn. When it was done, Clara's face was streaked with soot, her hair wild, lungs raw. John stood over her, rifle still in hand, eyes unreadable. "You should have stayed inside," he growled. Clara lifted her chin despite the smoke burning her throat. "And left you to fight alone." For the first time, something flickered in his gaze, not anger, not command. Respect. The next night, Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee. The children had gone to bed, and John sat across from her, shoulders heavy, shadows carved into his face by the lantern light. "You've got grit," he said finally. The words were rough, reluctant, but real. Clara blinked. It was the first time he'd spoken to her without the weight of command. "My father never saw it," she whispered, surprising herself. "He thought I was too soft. He gave me away like I was worth nothing." Her voice broke, but she steadied it. "I'm not nothing. I can fight. I can help." John's eyes softened for a heartbeat, then hardened again. "This land don't care about what you were. It only cares about what you can survive." Clara met his gaze. "Then I'll survive." Days turned into a tense rhythm. Every dawn, John rode the fence lines, scanning for trouble. The boys shadowed him, trying to prove themselves. Emily stayed close to Clara, clinging to her skirts as though she were the only safe harbor left. Clara began to teach Emily small things: how to knead bread, how to sweep, how to braid her hair. One afternoon, Emily whispered, "You're not like Ma. But you don't leave." The words caught Clara off guard. She knelt, brushing a curl from the girl's face. "I'm not leaving," she promised. The promise felt heavier than iron, but also truer than anything she had ever spoken. The storm broke 2 weeks later. It was evening, the sky painted with bruised clouds, thunder rumbling like war drums. John was mending a fence line when Clara spotted them, riders on the ridge, 6 or 7 silhouettes against the darkening sky. Her stomach dropped. "John," she cried, pointing. He saw them too. His face hardened. "Get the children inside. Now." Clara ran, gathering the children as thunder cracked overhead. They crowded into the parlor, the memory of the last attack thick in their minds. Clara barred the door, heart hammering, while John took his rifle and stepped outside. The riders descended like shadows. Shouts tore through the storm, followed by gunfire. The crack of rifles split the air, mingling with the roar of thunder. Clara clutched the children, whispering prayers. Then, glass shattered. A bandit crashed through the window, face twisted, knife glinting. Clara screamed, shoving Emily behind her. Her hand closed around the iron poker by the fire. Without thinking, she swung. The blow caught the intruder's temple with a sickening crack. He fell, groaning, blood streaking the floorboards. The boys stared, wide-eyed. Emily whimpered. Clara stood frozen, the poker shaking in her grip. John burst back inside, eyes blazing. He took in the scene, the fallen intruder, Clara's trembling stance, and nodded once. No words, just grim acknowledgement. The fight wasn't over. More shadows pressed against the windows, gunfire rattling the walls. Clara dragged the children to the cellar, shoving them inside. "I'll be back," she whispered, though her voice shook. Then she climbed back up, heart pounding, and grabbed one of the rifles John had left by the door. Her hands trembled, but she loaded it just as John had taught the boys. When the next attacker shoved the door, she pulled the trigger. The blast rocked her back, the recoil bruising her shoulder. The man howled and stumbled away into the storm. Smoke filled the air, gunpowder burning her nose. Clara's ears rang, but she didn't stop. She loaded again, teeth gritted. She was no longer just surviving. She was fighting. When the storm finally passed, silence fell heavy over the ranch. Bodies lay scattered in the mud outside, the survivors fleeing into the night. The barn smoked but stood. Inside, Clara sat slumped against the wall, the rifle across her lap, hands blistered and raw. John crouched beside her, touching her shoulder. "You held the line," he said. His voice was hoarse, but there was something in it she hadn't heard before. Not just respect. Admiration. Clara lifted her eyes, tears streaking her soot-stained face. I didn't have a choice. You did, he said quietly. You could have hidden. But you didn't. The children crept up from the cellar, wide-eyed and silent. Emily ran straight to Clara, wrapping small arms around her neck. The boys followed, their faces wary but changed. They looked at her not as an intruder, but as someone who had stood between them and death. For the first time, Clara felt the faint stirrings of belonging. But the reprieve was brief. Pinned to the barn door was a blood-stained scrap of paper. John tore it free, his jaw tightening as he read the words scrawled in charcoal. This ain't finished. Leave this land, or we'll finish you all. Clara's stomach knotted as John handed her the note. The storm had passed, but a greater one was still coming. The town gathered under the hard Wyoming sun, a restless silence gripping the air as if the land itself knew judgment was coming. The bodies of the outlaws lay buried outside the churchyard fence, where decent folk refused to share their ground with men of such black hearts. Clara stood near the church steps, her hands trembling as she held Matthew's youngest by the wrist. The little girl clutched a ragged doll, eyes wide with fear, as whispers coursed through the crowd. Widowed rancher marries a child bride, one woman murmured. Never was right, the way she came here. But she fought for those children. Stood up when others ran. The words swirled around Clara like dust devils. She lifted her chin, her back aching from exhaustion, but her gaze never wavered. She had bled for this family. She had stood with Matthew when the guns roared. And now, with smoke still curling from the charred barn, she knew something had been reborn in her too. Sheriff Caldwell pushed his way to the front, his star glinting in the sun. Folks, he said, voice carrying, we all saw what happened. These outlaws rode into our town, threatened women and children, and if it weren't for this girl, this young woman, there'd be more graves dug today. Murmurs rippled. Some nodded, others frowned. The preacher, a stern man with a long beard, cleared his throat. But the matter of her marriage ain't your concern, Matthew cut in, his deep voice steady. He stood tall beside Clara, dust and blood staining his shirt, but pride lighting his eyes. This girl was given to me lawful, and she's proved herself truer than any soul here. Judge her if you like, but know this, without her, my children would be orphans twice over. Silence followed, broken only by the cry of a hawk wheeling overhead. Clara felt the weight of every gaze, heavy and hot, but for the first time she didn't shrink. She met their stares head-on, her heart pounding like hooves on dry earth. The preacher's eyes softened. Then perhaps the Lord has his own ways. Perhaps he chose her to walk this path. The tension loosened, just a fraction. Clara exhaled, clutching the child closer. That night, after the last of the crowd had gone and the ranch lay quiet, Clara sat on the porch, staring at the ruins of the barn. Ash floated in the breeze, glowing faintly in the moonlight like dying fireflies. Matthew came out, lowering himself into the chair beside her. He said nothing for a long while, just stared at the horizon where the mountains cut a jagged line against the stars. Finally, he spoke. When they gave you to me, I was angry. Not at you, at the world. At the loss of my wife, the burden of 3 little mouths, the way grief makes a man hollow. I thought you'd be a burden. Clara swallowed, her throat tight. And now? He turned to her then, eyes raw and unflinching. Now I see you're the reason I'm still breathing. The reason my children ain't in the ground. The reason this ranch still stands. He paused. You've given more than anyone could ask. Tears blurred her vision, but they were not tears of sorrow. I didn't think I'd survive here, she whispered. I thought I'd be swallowed by the land, by the whispers, by you. But I think, this place made me stronger. Matthew reached over, calloused hand covering hers. Not stronger. Just finally seen. By morning, the ranch carried the scent of fresh bread. Clara moved through the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hair loose around her shoulders, as the children sat at the table, giggling over their bowls of porridge. The youngest, once so wary, now tugged at her sleeve, asking for honey. It was a sound Clara hadn't heard in weeks, children's laughter. A sound that healed something inside her she hadn't realized was broken. Matthew leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging his mouth. For the first time since the gun smoke, the house felt alive again. "You hear that?" he said quietly. Clara nodded, setting down the spoon. "That's what makes it worth it." But not all whispers died. When Clara rode into town days later, buying cloth and seed, eyes still followed her. The storekeeper's wife smiled, but two men by the saloon spat into the dust, muttering about a girl too young, too wild. Clara ignored them. She'd learned something in the fire and gun smoke, that whispers could only cut you if you let them. And she was done bleeding for small minds. Instead, she walked out with her head high, the basket on her arm heavy with supplies, her heart strangely light. Because the children waited at home. Because Matthew stood there too. Because the land, hard and unyielding, had accepted her. Ashes turned to wildflowers, roots deep and unshakable. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage as Clara paused by the ridge overlooking their ranch. The burned barn was being rebuilt, its skeleton rising strong against the sky. The field stretched golden in the sun, cattle grazing lazy, and children's voices drifted faint on the breeze. She was no longer the girl given away. No longer just a virgin bride bound by duty. She was something else now, wife, mother, fighter, survivor. And if folks still whispered, let them. The land knew the truth. The children knew. Matthew knew. And Clara? She smiled, a smile full of scars and strength, as the wind lifted her hair. So remember her story, the girl they gave away, who found herself in the ashes, who fought through whispers, bullets, and fire. She was more than what the world named her. She became what the world could never take. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because every tale like Clara's deserves to be remembered, just like the wildflowers that grow from the hardest ground.